Hello, we at Let's Talk Science are so excited to have you here. Today we will be learning about flight and building our own kites. Our skies are shared by machines and animals alike, from a goose formation migrating south to a commercial plane flying across the Atlantic, and even a kite flown by a family in a park. All flying objects are affected by the same basic forces of flight. In order to understand how any object flies, we first need to understand these four forces. The four forces are thrust, lift, drag, and weight. Thrust is the force that propels a flying machine forward, allowing it to move. Planes, for example, apply thrust using their engines. Birds create thrust by flapping their wings and pushing air behind them, which pulls the bird forward. Drag acts opposite to thrust and slows down the aircraft. It is caused by friction with the surrounding air. The flying object loses speed due to this friction with the air around it. This is why after you throw a paper airplane, it will eventually slow down and fall to the ground. In order to keep moving despite drag forces, a flying object must continue to have thrust. Weight is simple. It is the force of gravity that pulls us down towards the center of the Earth. Without gravity, we would be floating around like in outer space. The strength of gravity on an object depends on how heavy it is, hence the name weight. This is why heavier objects are harder to lift or throw, and this is why creating man-made flying objects like planes was very challenging. Planes are big and heavy, so engineers and scientists had to be very clever in overcoming the force of gravity to allow them to fly. This is where the final force, lift, comes in. The lift force acts upward, opposite the force of gravity, and allows the flying object to rise up despite gravity pulling it down. Lift is created using differences in air pressure around the flying object as it is moving. But what is air pressure? Though we do not see it, air applies pressure to its surroundings. You may have noticed it if you've ever shaken a closed soda bottle. The carbon dioxide that bubbles when the bottle is shaken applies pressure or pushes on the plastic of the bottle. It might even push enough to pop the bottle. This is an example of a gas's pressure force. Flying objects make use of this pressure force to create lift. Due to the shape of a plane's wings, for example, the air moves differently above and below the wing. The wing is curved on the top and flat on the bottom. As a plane rolls forward on the tarmac, the wings move through the air. The curved surface on the top causes the air to flow at a higher speed than the air below the wing. This difference in airflow speed causes a difference in pressure. The air pressure below the wing is greater than the air pressure above the wing. Because of this, the wing will be pushed upwards by the pressure. This is the lift force. The lift is caused by the airflow around the wings. So in order to create lift, a flying object has to be moving forward, and eventually its speed is high enough for the pressure force to create lift. This is why airplanes need to take up speed as they roll on the tarmac before liftoff. It is also why some birds take a running start as they flap their wings before starting to fly. When building a man-made flying machine, we must take into account all four of these forces. Weight and drag work against us and make flying more difficult, and we must make use of thrust and lift in order to counteract them and take to the air. Now, how do these apply to kites? Unlike a plane, a kite does not have wings, and it does not fly by moving forward. How can it have thrust and lift then? This is thanks to the wind. Let's look at the forces acting on a kite. Of course, a kite is subject to the force of gravity, so weight acts like we would expect it to. The wind blows into the front face of the kite and moves around it. This creates a difference in pressure. There is more pressure in the front and underneath the kite than above it. This is how a kite creates lift. The same wind causes the drag force due to the friction of the moving air onto the kite. The thrust force counteracting the drag is due to the tension in the kite's rope. The person holding the rope on the ground is pulling and therefore applying a force on the kite, pulling it against the wind that wants to blow it away. A person can apply just enough force to counteract the wind's push. This will allow the kite to remain stationary in the air, or they can choose to walk or run while holding the rope. This will give the kite more thrust, so it will also move through the air. Before we start building our own kites, let's review some of the history behind kite building and what kites have been used for other than having fun. Kites have been flown for over 2,000 years. It isn't known precisely when the first kite was flown, but it is believed that in 200 BC, a Chinese general flew a kite over a wall to observe the city he wanted to attack. Similarly, kites were used during World War I and World War II to observe the enemy, to signal pilots lost at sea, and to help soldiers practice hitting targets. Over 250 years ago, meteorologists used kites to carry thermometers up into the sky to record temperatures. Other information such as pressure, temperature, and humidity could later be collected. Finally, you can use kites to catch fish. This technique was quite popular in Southeast Asia. Historically, these kites were not made with the plastic materials you might be familiar with, but rather fishermen used very big plant leaves. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, also loved kites. He wanted to design a kite that could carry people. To accomplish this, he used many triangular pyramids to build what we will call a tetrahedron kite. A tetrahedron shape was considered favorable as the kite's surface area could be increased without a dramatic increase in weight, which was a problem with the more popular rectangular kites. In 1905, Bell built a giant tetrahedron kite called the Frost King, which was made up of 1,300 tetrahedron cells. In 1907, Bell built a tetrahedron kite called Cygnet that flew for 7 minutes at a maximum altitude of 168 feet. It was his first kite to have a person on board. His name was Lieutenant Thomas E. Selfridge. Today we will be building a tetrahedron kite just like Alexander Graham Bell. We will be making many tetrahedron-shaped sails that will attach together to make a kite. Having multiple sails of this shape means that we have a large surface area for the wind to push against, and so the lift force can be very strong compared to a simple flat rectangular kite. Also, tetrahedrons and triangles are strong shapes, so these kites can withstand strong winds. You might have noticed that many buildings are built out of triangles. This is again because they are a very strong shape. You can create tetrahedron kites with as many sails as you want. More sails means more surface area and therefore more lift. However, more sails also means your kite will be heavier and the force of gravity will be stronger, making it harder to take off. It is important to balance these two forces when designing your kite. Because kites rely on the wind to create their lift force, how well a kite can fly depends a lot on how strong the wind is. A large tetrahedron kite might be able to fly very well on a day with strong winds, but might be too heavy to take off when the wind is milder, because low winds would not be able to produce enough lift to overcome its weight. So let's get started building our tetrahedron kites. The first thing you'll need to do is collect your materials. You will need 2 to 3 large spools of cotton string or yarn, straws, glue sticks, scissors, a ruler, and some tissue paper. The first step is to cut each straw so it is about 7 inches in length. If you have a portion of your straw that's bendy, you're going to want to cut that section off first. If you don't, this will weaken your kite and it might fail under high winds. After cutting your straws, you'll want to cut a piece of yarn to 4 feet in length. If you have a 12-inch ruler, you can simply wrap your yarn around the ruler twice, and that will equal 4 feet in length. Next, you're going to want to take 3 straws and we're going to make a triangle by threading our yarn through each of the straws. This can be a little challenging, but in order to force this yarn through the straw, you can try to push it through with a pencil, or give the straw a good tap on the table to help the yarn through. Once your first straw is through, it's time to add the second straw. We recommend using a bobby pin to thread your yarn through the straw. Makes it a little bit easier to work through. This part isn't always easy, so just have a little bit of patience. Okay, 2 straws down, 1 more to go. Time to thread our last straw. Again, you can use a bobby pin to help threading the yarn through the straw a little bit easier. Perfect. Now that we have 3 straws on our yarn, we can now form a triangle. So bend the straws into a triangular shape and then pinch the corner so that you can begin to tie a knot. Before you tie the knot, you're going to want to make sure that the extended piece of string is 4 inches on one side and 20 inches on the other. Make sure to tie your strings tightly because any loose strings could make your kite weak. Our next step is to cut a piece of yarn so it is about 4 inches in length. We are then going to tie this piece of string to an empty corner of the triangle. Make sure to tie a tight knot so that your kite is structurally sound. Next, locate the longest piece of yarn extending from your triangle. As a reminder, this will be the piece that's about 20 inches in length. grab 2 straws and we're going to thread the straws onto this piece of yarn. Again, feel free to use a bobby pin if you find that easier. Once you have your 2 straws on, tie the yarn holding the 2 new straws onto a 4-each piece of yarn. You should be making a diamond shape shown here. Again, make sure that all your knots are nice and tight. We are going to be taking our diamond shape here and adding 1 more extra straw in order to generate our 3D pyramid or tetrahedron. In order to do this, we will need 2 more pieces of string. So our next step is to cut 1 piece of string that's about 4 inches in length and a second piece of yarn that is double the length of the straw, so about 14 inches. Next, we are going to tie one end of the 4-inch yarn to an empty corner, just like we've done before. Next, we'll tie the long piece of yarn to the remaining empty corner. And once we have a nice tight knot, we are going to thread the long piece of yarn through our last straw. We are going to bend in order to make our 3-dimensional pyramid or tetrahedron shape, and then tie the long and short strings together. Now that we have at least 4 tetrahedrons assembled, it's time to start adding tissue paper to our kite. For this part, you will need a piece of tissue paper approximately 24 inches by 18 inches. Grab 2 tetrahedrons and place them side by side in the middle of your tissue paper. You do not need to tie the edges or tie the strings of your tetrahedrons together, but you do need to make sure they are quite close together and held firm. Next, take a black marker and measure 1 inch from each vertex. Label this with a black dot. Once you have your 4 dots, use a ruler to connect them into a diamond shape. Our next step is to use a ruler to measure about 2 inches from each vertex, and we want to mark this location with a dot. Repeat this step for each of the corners. On the obtuse angles, the angles that are greater than 90 degrees, we want to make a diamond shape as shown here. Whereas on the acute angles, we're going to draw a straight line across as shown on your screen now. Again, acute angles are angles that are less than 90 degrees. Now that we have our template drawn, it's time to cut it out. Using scissors, cut the template out, including the cut off or cut out corners. This is what your piece should look like once it's been cut. Since we have 4 tetrahedrons in total, we need to repeat this process 3 more times to make sure each tetrahedron is covered in tissue. To save yourself a little bit of time, feel free to use your first template as a guide. Once you have all 4 of your tissue paper cutouts, we want to create flaps from the long edges of the tissue paper. These flaps are going to make it easier to glue the tissue paper to our tetrahedrons made of straw. Next, place 1 tetrahedron in the middle of the template. There should be enough tissue paper or your flaps to wrap around the straws. Once you're sure about the placement of your tetrahedron, apply glue to your flaps. Fold your flaps over the straws and apply enough pressure to make sure that the tissue paper is secured to the straws. You also want to be careful that you don't accidentally glue your strings. Your strings will be needed in future steps, so make sure that they are freely movable. Now it's time to do the second face, so fold over your tetrahedron, and just as we did before, we're going to apply glue to the flaps and then fold them over to attach to the straws. That looks great. As shown on the video, 2 of the tetrahedron faces should be covered with tissue paper by the end. Once we have our tetrahedron covered in tissue paper, the last thing we need to do before moving on is repeat with the remaining tetrahedrons. Each one should be covered in tissue paper. Now that all of our tetrahedrons are covered in tissue paper, it's time to start assembling our kite. Pick 3 tetrahedrons and arrange them on a flat surface, making one big triangle. The sides covered with tissue paper should all face the same way, preferably towards the back. We are going to be using the free strings to attach each tetrahedron together. Now it's time to add some height to our kite. So with your 3 tetrahedrons on a flat surface, place the 4th tetrahedron on top. Again, we will be using the strings to attach the tetrahedron to the top. We are so close to having a finished kite. The last thing we need to do is attach a string that we can control the rope from. So measure out about a 24-inch piece of yarn. We are going to tie the yarn to the front and back corners of the kite. bring this string to the back of your kite, and we will similarly knot the yarn on the back corner as well. You want to leave a little bit of room for this yarn to sag just a bit. So don't pull the yarn too tight when attaching it to the back corner. You might find it useful to start cutting off any of the extra yarn from the corners. This will also give your kite a nicer appearance. Okay, so now the last thing we need to do is we have to have something for the people on the ground to hold on to while they're flying their kite. So we're going to measure out about a 15 feet piece of yarn. We're going to attach one end of the yarn to a ruler or a cardboard tube. This will be what the user holds on to. Once you've secured the string, wrap the yarn around. The other end of the string can be knotted to the 24-inch piece of yarn that we looped from the front to the back of the kite. And there you have it, a completed kite. All that's left to do now is to go test it outdoors.